All right. Well, the updated format we're iterating here is that we will be hearing briefly from Frio to summarize what's happening across development. Then we will be posting asynchronously an update that people can read, which should go live sometime today or tomorrow. And then we'll sort of open up the floor for more wide-ranging discussion about the protocol. So why don't we kick it over to Frio? How are you, sir?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Amazing. All right. So, brief update this week. We'll start it off with my stuff. I get a high level. We're aiming to deploy the next PI, the next protocol upgrade on Sunday, which will include a implementation, a new gauge that will move the auto deposited PDV, which affects the gauge system, from CBEF to wstETH, and that will improve the censorship resistance of the protocol. We're also going to deploy a pod referral system there as well, which will allow you to, share your link and you can gain in some more pods for sharing. And then we also have some infrastructure updates. So all hands are on deck to get that out. And that's the main focus there. In parallel, we've been adding some front end features. Last week we shipped the pod marketplace feature where, it's an order of magnitude easier to interact on the pod marketplace as, part of our push for a better UX there. Feyyaz implemented a hotfix on the pod marketplace where I wanted to add another clarity feature there. And other than that, for last week, Extypen has been investigating some bugs there, and he's still continuing investigation on that end. Lastly, I think there were some infrastructure improvements on the subgraph related to the exchange. So that has been finalized, and now the exchange subgraph is running, and the UI is properly displaying data on that end. But yeah, that's it on the farm this week.
Very exciting stuff. Can you talk a little bit, you mentioned about the migration of liquidity and how that's going to improve the censorship resistance of the protocol. Can you just harp on that and explain why for a second?
Yeah, gladly. So at a high level, the LP in which the protocol incentivizes is CBEF, CB Bitcoin, and USDC. All of these assets are custodied and controlled by Coinbase. In addition, Base, the L2 that we're on, is also, closely related, joined with them as well. So thus, Pinto has an existential crisis where basically one entity can kind of shut down the protocol. Even if, we're on Base, if we have more censorship resistance, we could perform a forced withdrawal back to the L1 and still, in theory, live to see another day. So, one of the steps towards improving censorship resistance is to migrate our liquidity from wstETH, CBEF to wstETH. wstETH is custodied by Lido. They have, in itself is not a single entity, but more so a subset of many nodes. So from that perspective, it's much more censorship resistant than CBEF in terms of LSDs. So, we want to obviously improve the censorship resistance whenever necessary, and this is what sparked the idea to migrate our liquidity to wstETH. Now, performing such a migration itself is not the easiest thing in terms of manually converting everybody's assets to wstETH. So typically what we like to do is, create incentives in which people want to convert themselves from CBEF to wstETH. And in this instance, we are using the seed gauge system to migrate. What we want to do in practice is to slowly lower the seeds of CBEF, or I guess a better thing that's more more in line what's really happening is we want to decrease the optimal deposited target that the protocol is trying to target, lower for CBEF and increase it for wstETH over time in a gradual fashion, such that people have ample time to migrate in line with the incentives of the protocol, such that, what we want to prevent is a case where a user isn't very active on the farm and, you know, one day he or she gets back onto the farm and sees that their seeds are at zero. So we want to prevent that case. So, also in line with our philosophy is to build tech that's generalized and composable. So what we built is a gauge that sits on top of the seed gauge system, such that the optimal deposited distribution can be changed dynamically over time. We've had numerous conversations in the past of what such a system would look like. So, this is kind of like the infrastructure in which we can kind of expand that further if we so need to, given that we need to already migrate the CBEF distribution to wstETH. We built the infrastructure, and then we can discuss later if we do want to implement such a system where we, have the distribution be more dynamic in the future. So that was a lot of the infrastructure there. But yeah, I mean, after this upgrade, wstETH would have the same amount or the same distribution that CBEF has today. I think it should take around 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks. I think 15 days is the exact number. Around 15 days for the distribution to fully go to wstETH. We chose that because, a longer period seems like not necessary, but obviously we don't want it to be too short such that people are blindsided. So we felt like half a month was a reasonable target on that there. But yeah, that's the high level overview of the migration.
Thank you, sir. Well, I think the topic of the day that I really want to get into as a group, which is related to the migration and censorship resistance, which is sort of why I poked there, is governance. And in my mind, like the past, I don't know how many weeks consecutively, we've really focused in these town halls on the economics and what needs to be improved in this next larger iteration of the model, which we're tentatively calling Beanstalk 5. But the other half of the puzzle is governance, where if the goal is to really create a new currency, as exciting as I feel these updates that are going out next week, or I guess on Sunday, are, fundamentally the current governance structure where we have a multi-sig, that multi-sig unilaterally gets to determine changes to the system. There's no enforcement. There's no requirement even, let alone enforcement, of a need to disclose the changes significantly in advance. And so, Alfredo, you're right to point out that a lot of thought goes into making sure that people aren't surprised by significant changes to their holdings, even as marginal as seeds. That still, there's something fundamentally off about the fact that we could, and I'm using the royal we here to mean the Pinto multisig, we could just see changes and implement them with effectively no notice. And the interesting, I mean, maybe not the interesting thing, but one of the most interesting facts of this whole experience and experiment over the past 5+ years is that originally Brendan and I really didn't think of what we were doing. And Mikey, we didn't really think of what we were doing as solving a governance problem. That we were exclusively focused on the economics, and the result, is that there was a governance exploit. And at some level, in hindsight, the specific issue was kind of obvious. And that really speaks to just the fact that in practice, doing DeFi is really just as much a governance question as it is an economics question in many regards. And the governance ultimately is going to have to change here. The idea with Pinto is that we wrote an article a while back. I honestly don't remember exactly when, but probably around 2 years ago, maybe a little less than 2 years ago. If I had to guess, I'd say April of 24, detailing the fork system, maybe not detailing or speccing out a fork system, but describing a fork system where it was quite a controversial proposal at the time. But the premise is that the right way to get the best of both worlds between the ability to upgrade. Well, there's actually 3 things that you really want to optimize around. You want the ability to upgrade stuff with pretty low friction. You want immutability of contracts so that people don't have people are generally not exposed to as much risk related to smart contracts that are being used. And then the third element is that you want the people to have a very low friction in upgrading to the new software, which is similar but not the same. So it's like, 1, you want to make it difficult to change things out from under people. 2, you want to make it such that it's easy for developers to propose changes and to iterate. And then 3, you want to make it easy for users of the software to migrate to the newest version. And that's really the idea behind the fork system. That instead of having it such that you have a single smart contract where there's a single point, like a bottleneck in governance, or maybe even you could say like a dependency, where a single multisig is able to just change the governance unilaterally. This is something that when we deployed Pinto, we felt like more thought needed to be put into properly designing a fork system in practice. And even though Pinto in practice was the first fork of Beanstalk, it was a level forking system that existed above the single set of smart contracts. Instead, we manually deployed a new set of contracts, and then people had to choose to manually migrate to the new version. And ultimately, the current setup that we have is not a long-term viable setup. And so the expectation, our intention is that one of the things that is currently being developed, and I don't know if the development is super active, but it's development that we have slated for the near future, I'm talking Q1 or Q2, is we are going to have a first implementation of a fork system. And it won't be fully fleshed out. It'll be a V0. But nonetheless, this marks the potential to move away from the current governance system where really it is just controlled by a multisig, and move back to something closer to the spirit of the original Beanstalk, whereby anyone can propose an upgrade, and then the users get to choose whether to migrate. But it has some very unique properties around tyranny of the majority or the minority, which I think are actually better than the original governance system, and then separately due to the potential immutability, even though in this case, in the V0, the expectation would be that the contracts still have a multi-sig backup. We would still want like a hypernative style solution in there, and then some method to re-add functions. There's potentially a way to integrate hypernative more directly into the fork system, so it's like if they remove functions from contracts, then actually the only way to add them back would be a fork, even though that's a little bit probably intense at the start. But there's a lot of interesting little odds and ends there that we can design to be max efficient. And then the most interesting or relevant component. So the most interesting element of the system, which I want to talk about, is that the way, like, there's this problem which Frio just brought up, which is that you never want to have a situation where users are logging in after 3 months, 6 months, or 3 years. And 3 years is a reference to, California, I believe, Newsom just signed into a law, a bill, which if you don't use or move your crypto assets after 3 years in the state of California, and I guess that means if you're a resident of California, that the state can claim your digital assets from the custodian, whoever's custodying them. So in the spirit of creating a new currency, one thing that we fundamentally want to prevent is a phenomenon like what Frio was describing in the context of seeds for this liquidity migration, but at a larger scale, where imagine that there's a series of migrations via this fork system, which are all opt-in migrations. And there's no system for you to define under what conditions you would want to opt in. Well, that puts a lot of pressure on users to monitor and maintain the latest version of the software. Now it's not like, you need to run in certain instances like a hard fork of Bitcoin. You need to upgrade your Bitcoin software, or you're going to lose the ability to track the state of the network. But that, like, according to the latest fork choice rule, but that's fundamentally different than losing your Bitcoin or having your Bitcoin somehow devalue because you weren't on the latest software at the right time. And there's a different phenomenon at play here, where because this is a smart contract based system, and because the value of Pinto is actually derived from the liquidity that it trades against, quite explicitly, that we need to provide a system through which socially the social consensus can come to some sort of equilibrium around a fork. And one side note, when we talk about fork, a fork could just be implementing a new governance system. It doesn't need to be the same type of fork. There's potentially infinite variations of what a fork looks like in terms of economic restructuring, no economic restructuring. The Pinto fork was obviously an economic restructuring, in addition to a software upgrade, in addition to a governance change. So the Pinto fork was really a across the slate fork, and it didn't honor any of the liquid beans, but you could see a fork that honors a one-to-one migration from one version to the next. And so it really is just a software upgrade or a governance upgrade, for example. But so the other element here, and this is something that will likely be built with Tractor in its first implementation, is a system through which people can signal that if certain conditions are met, that they would like to be migrated. And those conditions can be arbitrary in nature. So it could be that Frio's wallet migrates. It could be that the Pinto multisig indicates that it's going to migrate. It could be that, or that it supports migration. It could be a combination of those two, plus some minimum amount of stock that has migrated, for example. The one downside with doing it via Tractor is that the Tractor, because it's a system for intents, doesn't really promise users execution. So in some sense, the users are going to be trusting that the system that we have in place for Tractor operators is one where they can have a reasonable expectation, the user, that some Tractor operator will actually migrate on their behalf. So potentially through a tip system or something like that. So this is, obviously the economic problems that we've been talking about over the past many, many months are the meat here. We're trying to create low volatility money, and I think with good reason we spend most of our time as a group talking about economics. But there really is this other piece of the puzzle in the form of governance. And I'm quite proud of the work that has gone into this, the research that has gone into this, and the current design that we have. I think it's really elegant and a significant improvement from modern smart contract governance, and I think speaks to where this stuff is going, where immutability and low developer friction needs to be balanced against one another, and you need to make it such that users are able to migrate with low friction to new software, which is also a developer friction issue, right? If it's such that developers need to go through a significant friction to get their work adopted, that increases the bar significantly for their work. And so that also really slows down DeFi development. So this is, I think, the other big piece of the puzzle. And hopefully this was an interesting little dialogue. Happy to answer questions. Happy to go deeper on any of this. Happy to answer, potential issues that people have flagged with what I've shared so far. Those are my thoughts. So the floor is open.
I'm curious how you see future experimentation happening with this fork system. Like, do you see people regularly spinning up more on the fringe versions of the model, and then people allocating some of their holdings to experiment in that fork, and then over time these things will sort themselves out? Or do you see the community collaborating in advance of these things? Um, Curious if you have vision to share there. And you're muted in case you're responding.
I was muted. Thank you. Well, my perspective on this has changed a bit throughout the past, I don't know how many years, where like the OG thought with Beanstalk was that there was going to be lots of experimentation, and that people as an experiment would really take this up and iterate constantly. But a couple of factors have proven that wrong. One, to do one of these experiments is just such a gargantuan effort, and particularly given the downsides where if a version of the system fails, potentially everyone that participates will lose all of their value that they put into it. Plus, it's a high friction to even change a couple of things. Plus, there's a social thing about, there's a lot of friction in trying to get people to migrate. If you're going to create like a new social consensus around a new currency, there has to be a good reason to do so. I think just from a pure social friction perspective. And so on the one hand, that has not played out. That original idea has not played out, which is to say that there's potentially a lot more experimentation that could be happening, particularly once this fork system goes live. For example, a version of the currency pegged to itself, where it's like now it's just tracking its own price, whatever that means. And I say whatever that means because it's not exactly clear how that would work in practice. It would be like a RAI style thing. But there's lots of little tests that it would be so cool to be able to get data on that. But when like the thing that is being experimented on is fundamentally a social system and a social game, where the only way for the data collected to be legitimate is for people to put their own money into the system. Otherwise, the incentive system isn't really going to be able to be tested truthfully or collect the best data. It's like there's a significant threshold that has to be reached to justify a new fork. And so I think there are likely to be worthwhile experiments. I think it's likely to be, insofar as there are going to be experiments like that, I think it's like more likely that they're going to be disclosed as less likely to work, but like almost a lost leader. There's a meta question around incentivizing people to participate in that. Like, so what I hope happens is that there is some meta level social consensus around these forks that is created, which basically set some ground rules under which, like at a meta level, each of these forks can opt into some like meta socially acceptable set of rules, even if they're not being enforced by the smart contracts or by the network. But certain rules that we believe as a community create the best conditions for long-term success of the currency. And so that could be something like what Pinto did with Beanstalk, which is, even though it was a restructuring of the debt, there's like a call option where if Pinto works at scale, that everyone who participated in Beanstalk will eventually get paid. That's, for example, and I think that there's a lot more to be said on what those rules might look like, and a lot more thought should go into exactly what those rules might look like. But the I think the most important thing to cover is that maybe not the most important thing to cover, but in the creation of Pinto, we tried to do that, right? Where it's like, we tried to still honor the original Beanstalk credit, and honor the like preserve the meta idea of Beanstalk with how the system was forked. And so that, if we're able to come up with a clear set of rules that people are generally in agreement, create like a meta incentive structure that can lead to more experimentation, but in a fashion that people are incentivized to experiment, because even if they lose money on an experiment, they may get some form of credit in the instance where, some system that is downstream of the data that was collected from their experiment worked, that they should potentially get compensated. So that has the potential to solve a lot of this friction around experimentation. And then when you add in the idea that in a fully fleshed out fork system, you can have a low friction you can have a low friction user experience to migrate, and you can have generally a safe way to do it, because these systems then all become immutable. I can imagine a world where the fork system, in combination with this meta governance structure that is purely social in its implementation, could actually facilitate an environment where there is lots of experimentation. And I still think lots, it's all relative. But even you look at Bitcoin. In my mind, there was significant experimentation in Bitcoin over the past 15 plus years, right? Where I think the important fact to keep in mind is when Bitcoin would get to a point where there were real meta existential scale questions about the currency, for example, to increase the block size, that those would be the instances where the system actually experiences social fork in a legitimate fashion. That's much more likely to be a catalyst in all of this, which is to say that as Pinto, as the idea of Beanstalk continues to progress, and if one of these experiments starts to grow to a significant scale, likely on the order of billions is required at this point, given the general market conditions, and people start to wake up to the fact that this is working and possible, I can imagine that type of environment would lead to more forks and experimentation. And that's exactly the moment where having that in a predefined way, it can't be something that emerges in that moment, because in that moment, all bets are off. But in that moment, if there is a predefined social rule set around what is considered an ethical fork in this community, I could see a lot of experimentation, and all of the experimentation done in a way that is aligned with the long-term success of creating a low volatility money.
Thank you.
What else? What other questions or thoughts do people have? Shoot.
So earlier you were talking about how users would be able to opt in potentially through Tractor to sort of have their positions auto-migrated to whatever a new fork might be. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of your thoughts on how to prevent those users from automatically migrating to like a malicious fork. So, maybe a fork is migrated or created, and, it's actually just going to like steal their assets, right? Like how does it maybe like, do they indicate to certain tractor operators like, oh, I trust this particular operator to migrate me? Or is it like, yeah, I'm just curious if you've thought about that at all yet.
Yeah, you're exactly right, which is to say that the general act is to say, if Pinto Pirate migrates, then you can migrate me, for example. So it's very much a social governance mechanism where how can a non-technical user validate that they're supposed to migrate or not? Well, at some level it is. You talk about verifiability. In some ways, for many users, the verifiability comes from a social verification. What are other people doing? And so the core of the idea is to allow people to define rules to act based on what other people do. Or if Pinto Pirate and Frio both migrate to this software, then you can migrate me to this software, for example. And in that way, you really push the trust to the social layer, which is where I think it should live, ultimately.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe another input that could be considered is like maybe total amount of value migrated or
Mm-hmm.
like, total amount of users.
Totally.
If someone like didn't have specific farmers that they knew or wanted to, indicate based on.
Exactly. So it doesn't necessarily need to be just a social thing, but there can be heuristics as well. And I think that's where, once you start to think about some rules like that, where you can sort of expect there to be a gradual, like slowly, then all at once phenomenon where it's like, getting the first couple percent doesn't really trigger a chain reaction. But after you get some percent, more and more people will migrate. And so then you can potentially have like a full or an almost full migration. And so then it's like, well, then there is some friction in the moment of migration, potentially, depending on how the fork intends to honor the existing outstanding currency. Like if I have Pinto or I have Pinto LP, one of the rules that I expect, although I haven't thought through this entirely yet, but one of the rules that I expect is that you have to be able to migrate one-to-one the currency, but maybe at the price of the oracle to prevent manipulation, for example. So it's not exactly clear what it is. But the idea is that as soon as you have this spectrum, what will likely emerge is a period in which there is no migration. There's only signaling of migration, which is sort of similar to what a lot of nodes do in networks where you have hard forks, or even soft forks, I believe, where you have nodes signaling that they're going to upgrade at a certain time. And in that way, we could potentially have a system where people authorize / signal a migration, and then people can be authorized based off of other authorizations. And then there can potentially be like a date at which the predefined migration would occur. And then other people can sort of all opt into that system, at once, effectively, and in that way eliminate the migration, the friction associated with migrating. So now we're talking a little bit like far into the future, in terms of what this is more of a fully fleshed out system, but I find it to be quite a compelling vision for how governance is really supposed to work. What else, folks? All right, well, the last thing that I wanted to cover is I think it's just helpful from a mental model perspective to talk through and think through hard fork and soft fork governance at the network layer, and then how that's related here. Where you think about a soft fork, and it's effectively like I think the simplest way to understand it is it's a backwards compatible upgrade. So maybe certain features or functionality is unlocked, but the older version of the software would not view blocks that are created by or new state that is created by the new software to be invalid according to the old rules. And this effectively prevents fragmentation of the network. So soft forks are easier from a governance perspective, whereas a hard fork, because the older version of the software would no longer view the state, if it's determined by the new software, to be valid, that now you actually have a fragmentation in the network. And the interesting thing about smart contract governance as it currently exists before this fork system is that you really have neither of those two things. Like with the hard fork system, you have this great property of practical immutability, where even if you're not running a node, there are certain inherent promises that you get where basically if you're not willing to migrate in a hard fork, you can keep the same rules. And it may be that everyone migrates to new rules, and so you staying on the old rules is actually a little bit worthless. But the thing is, when you have a hard fork, you actually create a copy of the network. And so, like, this is played out a couple times with Bitcoin, where now, excuse me, people have Bitcoin A and Bitcoin B, and they swap them depending on which is their favorite. And in that way, you can have like a fragment, like a split, a fork, literally a fork in the network, where prior you had one network, now you have two networks, and then you have a fragmentation at the social level. Whereas with smart contracts, you really have the opposite, which is to say that you have a single control hub, which is the smart contract, and whatever the whole system is governed through the smart contract, where if the rules of the smart contract are changed, it unilaterally changes the rules for all participants. And so this really sucks, where the only way to prevent that, where, the rules of the system can be changed out from under you, and you have no, even at a social level, like opting out and selling your Bitcoin A for Bitcoin B, you really don't have that choice in the same way, because your value is in this smart contract and the rules can just be changed. And there's no like splitting of the network. And the only way to get around this prior to the fork system is to make the contracts immutable. So now it's like, well, now you can't change the rules out from under under a user, but now you can't change the rules at all, which obviously is not really viable, given the incredible pace of advancement in our space. And so the fork system has some really great properties in this space where, on the one hand, you get the immutability. On the other hand, you get the upgradability, not even of a soft fork system where things have to be backwards compatible. You get the upgradability of a hard fork system where you can make any changes, even breaking changes. But because it's an opt-in system, you do have this forking of the network. You do have this fragmentation of the network where people can choose to stay on the old version of the system. So in my mind, this is really a best of all worlds. And it really takes the best of smart contract governance with the best of network governance and synthesizes it into a coherent governance framework for smart contract based systems of value, and particularly endogenous value, which is really the thing that makes this so tricky. So that, I think, really captures the elegance and the beauty of the fork system, and the way that we have governance designed at this point for how it should work in the future. And in addition to the economic changes, which I'm very excited to go deeper into designing over the next few months, and then actually building it over the next year or so, let's call it. I think the fork system, which is imminent, maybe a little bit premature, but soon, TM, is it's really exciting. And when you think about the story and the arc of Beanstalk and how the governance exploit was really the thing that did us in, it feels really good to feel like we've come to a point where we have 95+%, maybe 90%, don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but a tremendous amount of this problem solved very practically. So, at least in theory, now we have to implement it in practice. So, yeah, it's exciting. So, I'm going to open up the floor again one more time, to see if there's any questions that popped up based on what I just said, or, people want to ask now. Otherwise we'll wrap up. So the floor is open. Alrighty, folks. Thank you very much for coming. Hope this was interesting. I hope people can tell that we have a lot of exciting work and experimentation ahead of us. And even though we're in year 6 of this crazy journey, crazy experiment, there is much to be done. So it's a fun and exciting time. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Look forward to chatting again next week. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.